Hello, my name is Steve Mittleman, and welcome to my shop. Actually, welcome to Roger Wiegand's shop. Roger has been very gracious in allowing me to do this video in his shop where he has all the camera equipment set up, so you'll actually be able to see what I am doing a lot clearer and up close. So what we're going to do today is show you how I make what I call a segmented coffee mug. It consists of a stainless steel insert and the rest of the wood that you make, or we will make, to create this design, or in fact an infinite number of designs. I've been making these for over 10 years now, and the first one that I made was made from staves. And the reason I did it that way is that when you look at the internet and you look at the videos, they tell you that you should make this coffee mug from a single block, which is 4 inches by 4 inches by about 8 inches long. So I didn't have a 4-inch by 4-inch block. And so I had a 3-inch by 3-inch one. So I said, well, instead of that, I'll make it out of staves. Well, staves themselves are difficult to make. But the real problem is trying to hollow out this blank so that the stainless steel insert will actually fit in easily. Well, as you start to hollow out the beginning, you can't tell if it's wide enough for this part, and you can't tell if it's okay at the bottom because you can't get it in far enough. And so it creates a lot of problems. So I came up with the idea of making it segmented. And so the problem is, how do you get a 3-inch by 3-inch block into a 4-inch by 4-inch block? And the way I do that is to take my block, 3-inch by 3-inch, which I can readily find at most lumber supply stores or woodcraft stores. This is a 3 by 3-inch maple. And if I cut this lengthwise down the middle and insert a little spacer to make it 4 inches in that direction, and I'm going to make my spacer look something like this, and this is going to give me a nice design. And I'm using nice contrasting wood colors, so you will see that. And you can see that's the essence of what my design comes out to be. So if I cut it lengthwise this way and insert the filler strip, that makes it 4 inches this way, turn it 90 degrees, do the same thing, put insert in, and now I'll have a 4-inch by 4-inch block. And then I take another piece of wood for the bottom, which will be the bottom of the mug, and then we'll turn that, cut it into individual discs, which will look something like this. Put them all together, create my pattern that I want, finish it, and that will be the essence of the mug. So the basic technique is to take a 3-inch by 3-inch block, preferably something with unremarkable figuring, and then make it into a 4-inch by 4-inch block using some type of filler strip. Okay, so now we're going to make the filler strips. And because I have chosen to make them with the 2 dark stripes on the outside and the light stripe on the middle, we will need 8 of these, 2 for each of the sides. Each one will be 8 inches long, so I need a total of at least 64 inches. So we're going to make it a little bit larger and cut it appropriately. So I've already set up the table saw to cut my first strip, and I'm going to cut it a little less than a 1/2 inch. And so the 2 together will be a little less than 1 inch, and then the middle strip will then fill out that full 1 inch that I need to make my 3-inch blank into a 4-inch blank. So the dark strip is going to be walnut. And so let me now cut the strips. Notice that I'm using straight dimensional lumber. This is approximately 3/4 inch thick, or could be 4 by 4, closer to 1 inch thick. And that's really all we need, which will compensate for the difference in diameter from the top of the mug to the bottom of the mug. Right, so having done that, all right, I will readjust the saw, and let's cut the thinner strip for the out of a light colored wood, which again will be maple, which will match the original blank. Okay, I've readjusted the bandsaw for the thin strip. Now, you know, we could do this on a table saw just as easily, and perhaps the table saw will give us a smoother cut. So that's up to you, and it depends on what equipment you have in your own shop. So let's continue with this. Okay, so we cut those on the bandsaw, and typical of a bandsaw, the edges are not really smooth. So I'm going to touch up the edges on a disc sander just so that when we glue them together, we'll get a much better bond. Okay, so what we're going to do is cut this into 8-inch sections first. Notice that was just long enough to make the 4 pieces. Didn't even measure it. Dumb luck. All right, so let me just touch up the surfaces of these so that we can glue them together a little bit easier. So I'm going to continue to do these off camera, and you can see how quick and easy it is. It gives me more than sufficient smoothness so that when these things get glued together, they'll bond just fine. The thin strips, however, are a little bit trickier because I really don't feel comfortable holding this thin strip against the disc sander. So we're going to do this one by hand. And so for convenience, we have this nice sandpaper, which is sticky on one side. And so I'm just going to put it down on a flat surface, like so. And then I can safely take this piece here and sand it. One side is already smooth, and that's the way the edge was already plain smooth, so I don't have to do both sides on this one. We can just take this one and really just sand this back and forth a little bit. And that will get rid of the saw marks to make it a lot easier to glue together. And so now that we have done that, we'll finish up all of these off camera, and then we'll come back and then we'll glue these together. Okay, so let's start the glue up process. So usually when we glue pieces together like this, you're going to be tempted to get a lot of clamps and clamp this and let it dry overnight. Well, it turns out if you make these smooth enough, you really don't have to clamp them. If you just rub them back and forth with the glue in between, you'll see that you get a very, very thin layer, and it will just bond just perfectly. It only takes about 5 minutes before it sets up, and again, it takes hours before it fully cures. But for what we're doing, 10 to 15 minutes is going to be more than sufficient for our next step. So let's start to glue some of these up. And the way I know that I'm getting good coverage is I just take these pieces like this and I rub them back and forth, and I can tell they're smooth enough because they're fully covered with glue. So now if I take these and you just feel that surface tension, put them down here so that they are on the same plane, and that one is all set. Let that go for a while, and then I'll do that other piece. And now we'll continue to do these pieces. It really doesn't take too much glue to do this. And again, if you want to make sure that it's fully covered, and that tells you that the surfaces are in fact smooth enough. And this piece is curling a little bit, so I'll probably want to put a little clamp right on this one So, Roger, if you have a small spring clamp, that would be great. Just one of those spring clamps is fine. Oh, thank you. That's good. That's going to be good. All right, so that will be my next one. And then we will just keep doing this. Okay, by now the first one is sufficiently tacky, so now I can do the other half. There. And that is going to be just fine. So it only took that few minutes for the first glue surface to become sufficiently tacky so that it wouldn't slide when I put the second one on. So my first filler strip is done. I'm going to set that aside, let that dry a little bit more, and then continue doing the rest of these. I'll do these off camera so you don't have to be bored watching me just try to glue pieces together. Oh, by the way, the reason I just turned this over is I like to match the way the two pieces look. And you see this side is a little bit lighter than this side. It's just me, but really it's whatever way you want it to look. There I am trying to keep this surface plainer and clean. That'll make it a little bit easier when we get to the next step, although we can always fix it later. This is a very forgiving process. You notice that I've made these 8 inches long. If you actually do the calculations, we only have to hollow out 5.5 inches, so I've made it a little bit extra. And the reason for the extra is that I'm going to end up having to do a lot of saw cuts. If I have an 1/8 inch kerf on the blade, I'm going to cut into about 10 or 11 discs. So I'm going to lose a little bit more than an inch, 1.25 inches. And then there's going to be some other minor sanding and things, so 1.5 inches. So I add 1.5 inches to the 5.5 inches. So that brings it to 6.5, 7. And so I cut them at 8 just to give me a little bit more leeway and flexibility. So that's why I make them 8 inches long. Okay, so those are all set. While those things are curing and drying a little bit more, let's take my 3-inch block and cut it in half so that we can start to make it into a 4-inch block. So let's go back over to the bandsaw and let's cut that piece. Okay, we're going to cut this block exactly in half. If we're off a little bit, it's not a real problem. I'll show you how to compensate for that so that you won't be able to see the difference in the final product. But the way you know that it is cutting exactly in half is you set this up on the bandsaw so that you think it's exactly in half. If I run the saw blade up and down just to make a little line, and then turn it over, and take a look and see if that line lines up exactly with the blade, as it does now. So now that will be cut exactly in half.
That's a clever trick.
You didn't know that?
I didn't know that.
Oh. Oh, hey, I'm so happy I gave you some new information. Okay, so let's cut this. Okay, back to the gluing table, and let's make that 3-inch into 4 inches. Okay, so we're now going to make the 3-inch dimension into 4 dimensions, 4 inches rather. So we are going to glue these in like so. well, you can see it's going to be difficult to hold that top piece exactly in the right position, so we'll do it horizontally like this. Good. And I'm making this as planar as I can, and that will be fine. And okay, let this set up just for a little bit. Make sure there are no gaps. No gaps. Okay, we'll let that sit for a few minutes. Then we'll glue this part of the block on top. Then we'll do the same thing. We'll cut it again in the other direction and glue the other two pieces in.
I think that's going to be fine.
Okay, it is glued. And I think that's going to be fine, just like that. If you really want, we can clamp it just for insurance, and perhaps that's a good idea at this point, because we're going to let this sit for a little bit longer for the glue to set up before I cut it. So Roger, if you can give me a couple of those bigger clamps. That looks good. All right, I'm going to let this sit here for about 5 minutes or so, just so that it sets up a little bit more, and then we'll bring it over to the bandsaw again and cut it in the orthogonal direction. Okay, so we have glued up the first part of the block, and fortunately I kept the bandsaw at the same setting, and my original block was 3 inches by 3 inches, so without even having to check this again, I know I'm going to be right in the center. Well, actually, I did check it again because that's the way I am, but we will cut this pretty much in half. And again, if it's not exactly in half, that's not a major problem because we can compensate for that later. Okay. A quick touch up on this surface for gluing, and then we'll glue the other two strips in. Okay, I think our other two strips are sufficiently dry, and we'll do the same thing that we did before and glue these two strips like so. Put this one on top, and then we will have our large blank. You know, I should have mentioned at the beginning of the video that we are videoing this still in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And you notice that I am not wearing a mask. And that's because I'm really comfortable like this. I have been fully vaccinated. Roger has been fully vaccinated. He has a nice large shop, which is not inhabited by anyone else other than him. So we are quite comfortable doing it this way. Okay, I put a little too much glue in there, so we've got to smooth this out, squeeze it out a little bit. Yeah. You can actually feel the tension when you do that, and it's fairly obvious when you get to that point where it's just not going to move anymore. You see, I'm trying to move it, and can't do it. So that is done, and now if everything was cut properly and on the same plane, we should have uniform coverage of the glue, and we do. So I know all my surfaces are smooth enough and they were cut properly. Of course, if they weren't at this point, I'm not sure what I would do, but we were careful along the way, so I think we are in good shape. Okay, so now we will just let that set a little bit before we do the next step. And we'll glue this side here. That looks good. That looks good. Just enough glue squeeze out. That's fine. And so now we're going to let this set. The next step will be to glue on the base of the mug, and we'll do that in the next step. And then a waste block on each end so that we can put it on the lathe and turn it appropriately and put a foot on one end so that we can turn the entire mug. So let's let this set a little bit, and we will come back a little bit later after this glue has really set well. And the reason I want to wait a little bit longer this time is I have to square off each end, and so I want to make sure that everything is glued properly. You might also notice that this slipped a little bit, so this is not perfectly planar anymore. Again, that's not a problem. I cut this 8 inches long. I probably only needed 6.5 or 7 inches. That's why I make them a little bit longer to take care of any of those minor adjustments that have to be made. So let's leave this. We'll come back a little bit later and glue up the next stage, and then we can get to the lathe. Okay, so we've clamped this, left it for a while so it's nice and tight. The next thing we have to do is square up the ends so that when we put our waste block and our bottom on, things are nice and tight. And we have to do that because sometimes when we glue these together, the fillers stick out a little bit. So there's several ways we can do this. I can put it on the disc sander really quickly and do that. I can do it on the bandsaw. I could do it on a table saw. Any number of ways. I'm just going to take this over to the disc sander and just square those things up really quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to touch up the edges on the disc sander. Nice and smooth and flat. It was pretty simple because we took a lot of care when we glued this together, so sometimes you have to be more aggressive, but in this case it was really simple. So let's go back to the table and glue the bottom and the waste blocks on here, and then we can start to turn. Okay, for the bottom, we just take either a contrasting piece of wood, or you can take another piece from the original blank, the maple, either way. In this case, I'm going to use a dark piece of maple, of walnut rather. I think it's going to look better, but choice is up to you. Tight. So I was clever and made it the exact same size so that it's easy to align. But in fact, you don't have to do that. If it's smaller, just make sure that it's centered as best you can. If it's off a little bit, don't worry about it. We can figure that out later. We can compensate later for it, and you will see that when we start to do the turning. Okay. So that is on there, and then on top of that, we put a waste block because I'm going to put a tenon on this so that I can turn it on the lathe a little bit later. Okay. So again, we just do same thing. It looks a little cumbersome, looks a little awkward, but you'll see as soon as we start to turn it, this is going to shape up nicely for the coffee mug. Okay, so we can just leave that like so. We're going to put this right onto the lathe. Between the headstock and the tailstock, we'll have enough pressure here that that'll keep it nice and tight, so I don't even have to clamp it. So let's go over to the lathe, and we will start to turn this. Okay. All right, I've taken the blank. I have put it between centers. I have aligned it so that it is centered as best I can. And if you look from the overhead view, you'll see that the space between the corners and the tool rest is about equal. And so that is pretty good. And so now what I'm going to do is turn this almost round. And the reason I'm going to turn it almost round is I need 2 flat spots so that when I bring it back to the saw to cut this into individual discs, I need those 2 flats to keep the blank steady and turn and cut it safely. So I don't really want to turn something that is totally round on the bandsaw, which is not really safe. So with that said, let's start to turn this. There's a reason they call it hard maple. It is very hard and it does bounce. And you can see I am starting to get there. All right, I still have the flat, so I'm going to make it a little bit more round. And then I'm going to put a tenon on this end so that I can put it into the 4-jaw chuck. Okay, it's round enough. I still have the flat, and it doesn't matter that the diameters are a little bit off here because I'm really only interested in 2 orthogonal flats for when I put it on the saw. Okay, I think we are ready to take this over to the saw and start making my discs. But before I do that, remember I said it's very important to keep the orientation of all of the discs the same appropriately. So what I'm going to start to do is put an alignment mark like so. So when I cut the discs, I know I can always put it back in the right order, and that will keep any figuring that is in the blank uniform, and it will just the patterns will flow a lot better and it won't look hodgepodge. Okay, so let's take this off and go over to the saw. Okay, I've already set up the bandsaw so that I can make my first cut. The first cut will include the tenon, the bottom, and the first layer. After that, I'll reset the saw and cut each of the discs the same width, the 1/2 inch. So let's just cut the first one. And you notice those 2 flats are keeping the blank nice and secure so that I can cut this safely. Okay, I remember I told you we have to keep an alignment mark. Well, not only do I want to keep the order in which I cut these, I also want to make sure that I distinguish between the A face and the B face. Because if I take one disc and turn it around backwards, there may be a slight misalignment in these fill strips. And that's what I meant when I said we can compensate later in case things aren't perfectly symmetric. So as long as I keep the order proper and the orientation proper, then any minor errors will be absolutely invisible. So what I'm going to do is take that and put a small arrow right at that point, which just indicates which face I'm going to keep the same on all the discs. So just keep a small arrow. It doesn't matter which way the arrow goes as long as everything is consistent. And so now I will reset up the saw to cut all of the other discs the exact ½ that I want. Okay, I have readjusted the fence so that I will now cut my ½ wide discs. I have put the arrow on the inner side now, and there's a reason for that. It's just going to make it a lot easier in keeping track of where the orientation is. And the other thing I'm going to do, as I cut the discs, I am going to number them. So again, if I drop them in, and I can always put them back in the same order. So we can now start to cut all the discs. So why don't we turn the fan on or the exhaust on so we don't have to breathe too much dust. Slightly shy of 5½ inches, so I need one more. And the last one has to be a little bit more than the ½ inch. And the reason for that is that I want the end of it to come underneath the lip on the insert. If I don't do that, then the final disc that comes right up under the lip is going to be a little bit short. So I'm going to make it long so that I have exactly a ½ inch up to the lip, and then I have a little bit more that'll sneak underneath. So I'm going to make the final disc ½ inch plus a... Okay, so I have aligned all the discs together, dry stacked them. And now what I want to do is see how much of a rotation or what kind of a pattern I can make with this arrangement. So I can do a number of things. I can take each one and rotate that corner to that point and just keep doing that around.
I'm going to zoom in real close on you.
That's okay. And if I keep doing that, you see I get nice spiral. Right? And that works fine, except there's a problem if you do that. If I align one feature here to another feature there, corner to corner, as I change the diameter of these discs at the bottom, which is small, to the top, which is a little bit larger, there will be, again, a misalignment. And that's because when I make these inserts, I did not use wedges to make the segments. I used straight lines. And I can get away with that because there isn't a huge difference between this diameter and this diameter. But to compensate for that small error, rather than moving it like that, I'm going to take the center feature that I made, and perhaps we can see it on this side better, all right, and move it to the center of the next feature. And so if I'm off a little bit, you will not see that difference. So if I move that like that, move this like this, move this like this, you can see I'm starting to get a nice spiral pattern, much like the example that I showed you at the beginning of this video. All right, so we can do that. You could actually make them rare. You can make them random. You can go back and forth. infinite number of possibilities for the design. Okay, I have mounted the bottom of the mug and the first layer onto the lathe. And so the first step will be to hollow out the first section. And I find the easiest way to do hollowing is with a parting tool. It's fast and efficient and easy, straightforward. So let's just do that, and then we will get to the next steps. Okay, fits perfectly. There's reasonable space between the stainless steel insert and the body of the mug. So we're all set there. The next thing we want to do is make sure that this surface here is smooth enough so that I can glue the next disc on. And the easiest way to guarantee that that happens is to take a piece of sandpaper on a nice flat board and just do a really quick sand, and it'll get rid of all of the saw marks from the bandsaw. Okay, done. You can feel how smooth it is. I could put a pencil mark here and just do a quick sanding. You'd see that. That's fine. This is going to be a very repetitive task as we do each disc. So I'll spend time on the first disc or 2 or 3 discs, and then we'll just do the rest really, really fast. So now that we've done that, we can now start to turn the outside. And for that, I will use a bowl gouge. I use a bowl gouge for almost everything. A bowl gouge, parting tool, for me, they're easy to use. They're fairly efficient, and so I don't spend a lot of time using lots of different kinds of tools. So now we're going to start to shape the outside, and now I can control the thickness of the wall of the mug. And I'm going to make it a little bit larger than necessary for now, and at the end, when the entire mug is completed, we'll do one last cut and do the final shaping. Notice that I did not turn down the outside lip. I'm going to always leave the last 1/16 of an inch or so of each disc at the original diameter, so that when I take the next disc, line it up, it's easy to keep it concentric. And then after I glue the second disc on, I will then completely turn down the first disc and most of the next disc, again, leaving just a little bit of a lip so that I can align the next disc. Okay, All right. So this surface here was also cut from the saw and maybe a little bit rough. So I'm just going to touch this up really quickly on the disc sander, and then we will glue this on. So just hold on a second. I only sand one side of the disc on the disc sander, and that's the side where the arrow is pointing. That was from my orientation mark. And then these two surfaces will fit perfectly. I'm going to align the original orientation marks and then rotate it the amount that I want. All right. And glue appropriately. And so I'll put a little bit of glue here. I'm going to align those orientation marks and then rotate it just a little bit according to our initial plan. And I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure with the tailstock. There. While that glue is setting up, I'm going to take the next disc, bring it over to the disc sander, and just give it a real quick sanding. Okay, the surface is ready to go. But while I have pressure on the tailstock, I can now turn down the next disc and get ready for the third one. Okay, this is on sufficiently, glued on sufficiently well. I can now turn this and hollow out the next layer. So again, I take my parting tool and let's hollow out the next layer. Okay, disc number 3. I've already sanded that surface. We'll align it to the previous one, then we'll do the rotation. A little bit of glue on the appropriate side. Good uniform coverage. put that narrow mark roughly in the middle of the wider spacing on the other side. Apply a little bit of pressure just for insurance. There. And now we'll take disc number 4. While that's setting up, let me just touch this side up quickly on the disc sander. So, as I said, so I align the third disc to the second disc appropriately, and now I can turn the previous discs down to approximately the right diameter. Okay, so now we're ready to glue on the next disc. I did check to see that my wall thickness is probably about 1/4 of an inch, a little thicker than it has to be. But we'll keep going for a little bit, and then we will retune that as we go along. And we have plenty of time, even after we finish this, to do that final cut to make sure everything is the appropriate diameter and appropriate thicknesses. So. Make sure we glue the proper side that we just sanded. In my case, it's the side that is the arrow. And we'll make sure that we align these orientation marks correctly, and then rotate it. Okay, notice that time I did not hollow it out first. That's because I just decided to change. I think I got bored doing it the same way each time. It doesn't really matter as long as we keep this outer lip okay at the same diameter for the next disc, and it is sufficiently glued to the previous disc so that I can do the hollowing. Actually, this is fairly safe because all of the pressure that I'm doing is axial, and so even though the glue hasn't fully cured and fully set, I'm not putting any stress on it this way, so it's fairly safe to continue to do the hollowing without waiting much in between. So let me hollow this out first, and then perhaps we'll just do all the rest offline or really quickly. And it's still a little bit tight. Let me just do it a little bit more. And that's the advantage of doing it this way, because I can keep working on it and just sneaking up on it to get just the right amount of air gap that I want between the insert and the body of the mug. So I think the next pass will work. That's a perfect fit. Just a little bit of wiggle room gives me a little bit of a space. It's still seated at the bottom. So now I've done 4 discs. I've got 7 more to go. So we'll just keep working at it, and you can video or not as we go. Because we're going to edit most of this out, because no one wants to see me do the same thing over and over and over again.
Yep.
And to save a little time, I'm going to take all of these discs and do that sanding of that one surface all at the same time. Then I won't have to go back and forth. I made it too perfect. It's nice, tight fit, which is fine. Perfect. Notice that this just fits inside the lip on that stainless steel insert. And so now I can go back to this point here, trim it up, and then we'll be finished with our lathe work. Well, at least this part of lathe work, we still have to reshape the entire mug, but that will be the fun part. Notice that when this is now fully inserted, it seats against this, and the width of this disc and the width of that disc is the same, and so that'll make the overall mug look better. The first time I tried this many years ago, I forgot about that, and it ended up that the top disc was about half as much as it should be, and it looked a little bit strange for my first mug or two. Yeah, it wasn't too bad, but I learned. Okay, so now we know where the outside of the mug is, so I know that I have to turn it, roughly like that. And that little spacing between the line I drew and this counts for the thickness of the metal lip. Okay, this is getting a little bit long and a little bit thin, so Roger was right. Should put a cone in there or something to stabilize it. And do you have a cone?
Use the tailstock. It's hanging next to the electrical.
Ah, I think I put this.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, perfect. I knew there's a reason why I use your shop. Yeah. Not as smoothly with all the equipment on the other hand, and you've got everything I need. Let's see if that sounds better. Okay, there it is. Notice that I rounded this part here. It's a little bit proud of the insert. I could make it just a little bit smaller if I want, but I think maybe I'll leave it just like that because we're going to do some final sanding, and that might bring it down just a little bit. Okay, so I think as long as it's set up like this, I'm going to sand very lightly and smoothly this top part here. Then we'll part it off, and I will reverse chuck it, fix the bottom, and then we will put a finish on it and do the last minute gluing way at the end. Generally, when you're using regular urethane, you want to sand to at least 240, and then the viscosity of the urethane will fill in any of the scratches from the paper. If you're using poly or wipe-on poly, which is what we're going to use, and I'll explain why we want to use wipe-on poly for the finish, you want to go a little bit more than that because wipe-on poly is a lot thinner. The reason I want to use wipe-on poly rather than a friction polish or a wax or oil is that this is a mug that you're going to be holding in your hand a lot. And if you put a wax on it, the wax will gradually wear away. Oils can get dirty. If you put the urethane on or some real hard finish, the finish will last a long, long time. So it's appropriate to put urethane finish on this. I always go a lot better than that. And so I'll sand this finish probably to about 600. We'll see how it looks, and then we'll put the finish on after I reverse chuck it and fix the bottom, do all that. And we'll put several coats of wipe-on poly on it. So I'm just going to go very quickly through a series of grits just to make sure I get rid of all of the tool marks, and then we'll get ready for the next step. No, we'll do a final sanding when we turn it over because we have to do the bottom also. Oh, what do you think of that shape? Like that? Mm-hmm. Happy with it?
Nice. Looks good.
Okay. So I think if we part it off, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to the saw and just cut off that last little bit. Maybe I'll take it down a little bit more and then we'll take it off. But before we do that, just as a last check, how's that feel? You like that? Well, in your hand, if you're going to be drinking that with, you don't have to put coffee in it, you know.
Yeah.
You can put any beverage you want.
Can you? Bourbon?
Whatever. If you want to fill that with bourbon, good luck to you. You will sleep well. Okay. So it looks a little gray, but as you know, as soon as we put the finish on, the colors will jump right out at you, just like this one. And the finish will be just as shiny as this. So as long as I still have the support here, let me just make that bottom a little bit thinner, and then we'll reverse chuck it and finish it up. Okay, just want to make sure that that was slightly concave. And we just do one quick pass with this, and then we'll saw it off. Okay, let me not push my luck trying to make that too thin and have it fly off and catch and fly around the room. So we'll just saw off that last little bit. There you go. Come on, get out. Oh, that came nice and close. So, almost done. So we can reverse chuck this in a couple of ways. I can make a jam chuck and put it on like so. And that's one way. Or I can actually just use the jaws and just hold it like that. If I do that, what I'm going to do is put a rubber band or some rubber around this so that I don't scratch or dent this too much. You know, I think I'm going to try to make a jam chuck. Sounds like a lot of fun to do. And it's a good practice, you know. Doesn't hurt. So we will do that. And one more thing I wanted to mention is that, what did I do with my extra piece? This is the one. Okay. Notice I started with 8 inches and we used up almost all of it. I did have one extra piece, but this was my emergency backup in case I broke a piece or did something nasty to it. There's enough room for just one more. And you never can tell. Another little insurance measure. Okay, so when I left off last time, we had sanded the outside of the mug. We parted it off. And so what I did is I went home and I made a really simple jam chuck. And of course, in my haste, I made it a little bit too small. But that's easily taken care of when you put a layer of paper towels on there. And now it fits nice and snug. All right, because when I parted it off and I sawed that this off of the waste block, I was so close that it was very easy just to sand this by hand. Well, the other traditional way of doing it is take one of the gouges and actually turn it off that way. Now, some people are a bit squeamish about that because this is really only held on by the jam chuck. But the other way you can do it is power sand it off. And power sand that. And once you get that little nub off, then by hand, you can, once you get that off by hand, you can just sand it off very, very nicely. So now it's nice and smooth, and now we're ready to coat it. And so what we're going to do is put the coating on first and glue it into the stainless steel insert as the last step. And the way I put on a coating is my special polyurethane coating. The reason we're using polyurethane is that this is a coffee mug and we're going to be holding it a lot. And so we want something that will stay clean, easily wipe off clean, it'll be durable. And so what I do is I take wipe-on poly. I prefer the Minwax, which you can get at Lowe's. Others will work, but I think this particular one has just the right viscosity, which works out very well. Okay, so the next step that we're going to do is to actually put the coating on. And first thing I'm going to do is protect Roger's lathe from getting re-urethaned. Although the small amount of the polyurethane and put it in one of these cups. And you get these for free when you order Chinese food. Or you go to BJ's or one of those places if they still give out samples. Or you can buy a bunch of these small cups. But you don't use much urethane. It's really very simple. And then I take a cotton cloth. And this comes from a T-shirt that I should have thrown away 3 years ago. And the advantage of that is that it has no lint. And I just cut it up into random pieces. And first we turn the lathe back on. Turn at relatively slow speed. Now this is turning probably at about 50 RPM. The lathe that I have at home is about 250 RPM, and that works fine for this. And just dip it in, put it on, and just wipe it across. If you look at this closely, you'll see that it's actually saturated the cloth. And as I bring it across, if it dries out, again, as it is doing now, not a problem. You just take a little bit more. And look at those colors just come alive. The other advantage of doing this is that as I drag this across, any dust that might be left over from when I did the sanding and I didn't wipe it off sufficiently gets dragged off to the end. So this is actually a very, very clean surface. Oops, I didn't do the bottom. The bottom is slightly concave, so I'm going to just use my finger for that. Sometimes if it's not too concave, yes, see, that would work. We can just do it like that. And the first coat soaks in very, very quickly. And you can see it goes on nice and shiny. And after a while, you'll actually start to see some dry spots. The trick here is don't continue to coat it. Once I've put several coats on, leave it alone. After a few minutes, if I stop the lathe, you'll see some places may start to dry off. I can see a few dry spots here. And that's just because the wood is porous and it's soaking in. We're going to leave this alone for about 1 or 2 days and let that soak in and cure. And then we'll come back, put another coating on, do the same thing. And after that, we can put several thin coatings on top, and 4 coatings, this will shine. And because it's a mug that we're going to hold in our hands a lot, maybe we'll put on 5 or 6 coatings, but we can decide to do that later or whatever you want to do when you make your own. So I think we'll just leave this alone. I'll come back in 2 days and we'll take care of it. Now, I really don't want to tie up Roger's lathe like this. That's really not fair. So we can actually take this off, and because it's in a jam chuck, I can just take that right off. Or I could actually take the 4-jar chuck off, but then Roger may want to use that. So if I just take this and loosen this up, I can take this off. We can set this aside somewhere, let it dry in a corner of the shop, and then Roger can get back to other kinds of work. So I'll see you in 2 days. Okay, we're back after a day or so, or 2 days. Surface is really dry. It looks like that urethane soaked right in. It's actually very smooth. We're not going to sand it between the first 2 coats. We'll think about doing a very light sanding sometime later. So now just put another coat on and let that dry, and we'll see if that takes a day or so to dry. And the same thing as before. We just dip the cloth in and make sure we get coverage everywhere. And if you get too thick a coating on, that's not a problem, because as I drag the cloth along, it's going to give it a nice, smooth, even coat. And let's just do the bottom as well, just to finish it off. And one last pass to smooth it, and you can see the cloth is still saturated, which is good. Okay, I'm going to let this spin for about 5 or 10 minutes just so that the surface skins over just a little bit, and this will eliminate sagging before I take it off and put it in another corner of the shop so Roger can go back and use his lathe for other good stuff. So we'll put that away for another day or so, let it dry, and we'll come back and put on the 3rd coat. 3rd and 4th coats and any subsequent coats are really fast. We only have to let them dry about an hour in between. But this coat here may take a little bit longer, so we'll wait a day on this one. So I'll see you in another day. All right, when we put that last coating on, if you remember, I left it on the lathe and I left it turning for a while so that the urethane would set up and we wouldn't get any sags. Well, I am a little bit too impatient sometimes, and I turned the lathe off a little bit too soon. So when I looked at it, there was a slight sag right in the middle here. So I took it home, sanded it, let it dry overnight, sanded it down with 800 grit sandpaper, smoothed it out, did a quick 800 grit over the entire surface, just enough to dull the surface, put another thin coat on and another thin coat on after that. So I did all of that at home, saved Roger's shop from being tied up. And so it is actually done except for putting in the insert. And that surface looks pretty good. What do you think, Roger? Looks good?
It looks splendid.
All right. So the next step is to take the insert. I'm going to put a little bit of clear silicone glue on the inside of this rim. Put this on, let it set up, and we will then be 100% done. So I went to Home Depot, and I got this stuff called E6000. I have never used this before, but we'll try it. Turn this around to smooth it out. And clean up a little bit that I got on the stainless steel insert, which is easy to clean up. And the reason I turn this is just to get a nice even coating. I can feel it starting to set up very slowly. So we are done. And this was the one that I used as the model at the beginning of the video. And you see they're almost the same, except they're inverse colors. So what do you think, Roger? Success?
I think it's fabulous.
Okay. Now, before we end the video, I just want to say that I want to thank Roger very much for not only letting me use his shop, but also being director, editor, videographer, and has actually spent far more time on this than I have actually doing the demo. And one of the great joys of making something like this is being able to give it to someone whose work you really appreciate and who you like. So Roger, this is for you. Enjoy.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will enjoy
Great.
it.
Good.